Hello, I welcome everybody who has joined us. I'm happy that today we are here together. This is the 215th day of the full-scale invasion of Russia to our land, and today we invited the leading Ukrainian experts to speak about the events which are taking place during the last week, which was very full of events, and in the whole media space, in spite of whether it's Ukrainian or international one. So in a nutshell, about the several organizational points of our meeting. Our meeting is open for your publications, for the photos and video footage. It will last for about an hour, and you will have an opportunity to pose your questions to our experts after we discuss with them some of the key issues. So now I'd like to introduce our experts. Vadym Denysenko, Executive Director of the Ukrainian Institute for the Future. Alina Frolova, Deputy Minister of Defense of Ukraine in 2019-2020 and Deputy Chair of the Board for the Center for Defense Strategies. Nataliya Butyrska, expert on East Asia, Master of International Relations. And Olexander Khara, the expert on Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, and also advisor to the Defense Minister of Ukraine in 2020. The first question I'd like to discuss with you is the issue of mobilization in Russian Federation, the so-called partial mobilization. So maybe, Alina, let us start with you. How do you assess it? Which consequences it can have for Ukraine? Because according to different estimates, we could hear different figures. Some people speak about 300,000. Some people say that it will be at least 1 million or even more of people. So what are your estimates? Well, considering what we see now, it's definitely not 300,000. I think that this is just the hidden point, what was there, to have the opportunity to have unlimited mobilization, that they will take as many people as they need during the time period which they need again. So whether it can be 1 million, yes, it can be 1 million. Well, of course, it won't be 1 million of simultaneous and one time and very quickly, but it can be even 1 million or more, because let's not forget that the population of Russia is rather big, and even 1 million is not a substantial percent from the men who can go to the front line. So we need to get ready. On the one hand, those are unqualified servicemen who definitely won't be as efficient as the professional army are, and definitely it will make the logistic processes even harder and more complicated in the Russian army, because we can see that their logistics does not cope with the number of issues which they have now, and the number of the victims among them will be substantial, but all of those are still high numbers, and we need to get ready to that from the perspective of the military approach. Maybe from our side we should increase the amount of weaponry, armament, aid and relief and assistance. We just cannot just consider that those are the totally untrained and drunk people. I wouldn't assume that, but I would say that our military board and our military superiors, considering these statements, they understand that, and we will get ready to that. A different issue, why it was done now and why it was done so quickly. I think that all of that is done closer to the referendums, so-called referendums, because I'm totally sure that on the 30th the Russians will announce that they are taking to Russia all of those so-called new regions. After that, they will declare the opportunity to use nuclear weapons. Well, Putin already has mentioned about that. And after that, they will try to hold the line, the front line with these forces. They need to hold the line till the 30th to show as if they've already totally have a stable front line. And after the 30th, from their perspective, to have the useful and profitable for them position at the negotiations, at the talks. I'm not sure that there are Ukrainian politicians who are ready to take part in the talks now, though I would say this is just the dream or the vision of Putin or the Russians, but they're working according to this strategy. This 1 million of conscripts and nuclear threats are all the components of all this story to try to bargain for some of the discounts. Vadym, you are systematically studying the processes which are taking place in Russia from within. What can you tell about the mobilization and all of those announcements and statements which were declared recently? We understand that we are now in our own bubble, and we do hope that this very mobilization will launch destabilization processes within Russia. Are those processes possible? Because we can see some of the strikes and protests taking place. Is it really substantial in Russia? Will it have any consequences in the country? Thank you. First of all, if we are speaking about the protest moods which we see in Russian Federation, we may say that they are implemented only in one region, that is Dagestan. And to be more precise, in fact, they are localized within one of the nations, that is Kumyks, one of the nations in Dagestan. Dagestan is one of the most multinational parts of Russian Federation. Up to 40 nations are located at this small territory. So relatively small territory. For such a country as Russia is, for the system to begin failing, we need at least the protests to start simultaneously, at least in 5 regions, 5+ regions, and then the system will start under certain circumstances. It's not compulsory. It can begin failing. As of now, the conflict is only in one region, Dagestan. Theoretically, just now they announced the meeting in Kabardino-Balkaria, one of the neighboring regions that is in its capital, Nalchik. We will see what it will lead to, but it's a bit too early to say that the Caucasus has begun to burn and to enter to some systematic anti-Putin strikes. Moreover, we saw today the announcement of Kadyrov, who decided to insult the Dagestan residents, and he said that the Chechen guys have already fulfilled their obligations, and it again led to another wave of protests. But we'll see if it leads to anything global within the Caucasus, let alone the Russian Federation. If we speak about Russia as it is, let's not forget that all the revolutions in Russia have always taken place in the capitals. So as of now, we can speak about some of the indirect symptoms, but now we can definitely say that in Petersburg, the situation is a bit has higher tension degree than in lots of other regions in the country, but it's not even critical, it's not even close to it, it's not even complicated for the authorities. But as for Moscow, there are no protest moods, we don't see them at all. Besides that, it's connected with the issues that the mobilization threshold for such city of Moscow is only 16 to 18,000, according to different estimates. It's approximately 0.1% of the population of the city. In this case, it cannot lead to any global failures. Secondly, if we speak about the reasons of mobilization, the reasons of the speeding up of the referendums, because those are interconnected, and about the annexation of our territories, the processes have sped up substantially. After the summit and after the meeting in Samarkand, we can say that something has taken place in the elite of Russia. What exactly? It's hard to say. But under some of the indirect signs, we may say that Putin de facto stopped being an alpha male who took unanimously all the decisions in Russia, and now we have to deal with some kind of collective Putin. And Patrushev definitely belongs to this collective Putin, and the Kovalchuk's brothers are also belonging to this collective Putin, because up till the last moment, Putin didn't want mobilization. He didn't want to do lots of things. Let us just remember that 2 weeks before the summit, Russia took place about the delaying of the referendum, and something has happened after that. Something has happened in the elites. What exactly, it's hard to say. But in fact, it's not just the one-person authority of Putin. At this stage, this is the collective Putin which is taking some decisions. Alexander, this pseudo-referendum and the further, we would assume, announcement about the joining of our occupied territories to Russia. So which international response do we expect for such actions? Thank you. Well, there was already the response that the whole civilized world will not perceive those pseudo-referendums and annexation as it took place in the more attractive conditions of 2014, when they had some of the Western elites saying, well, it could be because these were pro-Russian regions, Khrushchev gave the Crimea in a weird way. So now it is totally obvious. There is occupation, there are combats and warfare, and there are no legal reasons for that. The world will not perceive it. And there was some information that even Serbia, the most ideological ally of Russian Federation, is not going to do that, because undoubtedly they have their own Kosovo, which they don't want to give away, and they think that it was just repulsed forcefully. And this is one of the reasons why Ukraine still does not acknowledge the independence of Kosovo, though those in fact, reasons are totally different. In comparison with Donetsk and Luhansk, those were ethnical cleansers. And in fact, secondly, it is connected with the mobilization and the threats which have become more numerous about the use of nuclear weapons. Just last week, President Biden said that you shouldn't do that. This was one of the signals to Moscow. Then yesterday, the day before yesterday, Blinken and Sullivan said that there will be a horrible response. They said that they are communicating with Russians directly about the possible consequences, and those consequences can be as big that they would be even in the interest of Ukraine, that the war could even stop. Because the United States and their allies can interfere into this conflict on our side, on our territory, and can create military defeat to Russia if Putin is crazy enough to push this button. There is such a slight chance of that, because it's rational, but he is living in the irrational reality. That is why we consider it to be irrational, crazy actor in this military reality. Several points about mobilization. First of all, what we need to speak about, as the Ukrainian defense forces, the armed forces of Ukraine, have grinded the most military capable part of their forces. Looking at even the most optimistic figures of 55,000 of Russian victims, and if we add the wounded, the whole group which began the invasion is totally destroyed. So looking from the military perspective, of course, they could not have been trained in such a short period. They can only fill the gaps and provide them with the expendables. But at least it's impossible for them to create something of military capabilities, at least of that level which used to be. So those people are needed to keep the territories, to hold the territories which they are going to annex, not to provide any offensive. Of course, we cannot believe Putin about the partial mobilization, because when he said that there is no mobilization, there was hidden or concealed mobilization. So he took the conscripts and he took Russian fascists and nationalists into the troops, and some of our citizens who were living on the temporarily occupied territories. And the same will take place after the annexation. Our citizens who are still staying at those territories will definitely be taking part, they will be taken to the Russian troops against us. So this is the challenge for our foreign partners, whether those escapees from the mobilization should get to their countries. The Baltic countries consider it to be a very clever thing. That is the threat to the national security. They don't let them in. The access to Finland is an issue, but it's a different one with Georgia. Why do I consider that even as of humanitarian needs, you shouldn't let the Russians into your countries? For them to be a destabilizing factor within Russian Federation, for them to be sent to the front line, and for them to have the choice either to surrender and to have the worthy conditions of life, because they can Google and see how the armed forces of Ukraine treat the Russians prisoners of war, and I would say this is the best option for them to sit till the end of this conflict. And secondly, the things which are taking place as now, that is the burning of the military committees, and today we had the video when one of those military commissioners was severely wounded. All of that is really needed by us and by Russian society, in fact, for a regimen of Putin to be destabilized. I don't believe in any protests or revolutions. It is not possible in Russia. Russians are not capable for that. But it is definitely a destabilizing factor. And just imagine, some of them are going to the front line, and there are still remnants of professional army there who are capable to do something, but they are exhausted. They are not motivated. The people who are ready to surrender, they will just totally decrease the morale and the forces which they have on the occupied territories. Definitely it will be in the interests of Ukraine. So I think one more successful operation like this used to take place in the Kharkiv direction. It will finally kill any illusions among the Russians with weapons in their arms that they can cardinally do something or escalate the situation. So it's in our interests for anyone who wants to flee, in fact, to get to the Russian armed forces, but with the decreased morale, with the lack of wish to fight, and with the wish to surrender. Lately we hear the narrative from the Russians that after the annexation of our territories, they will announce that they will further, with any means, they will protect those territories, including the nuclear weapons use. For us, the Ukrainians, it's not that comprehensible, because we know about the successful operations of our armed forces who totally demolished the warehouses in Saki, which are in the Crimea. What will change? Why is this narrative promoted? Well, the thing is that Putin has used all the possible means on our territory against our people. So the expectations and hopes for that the beginning of the full-scale war and the processes which took place will play some role and intimidate us. Some of the hopes and expectations that we have uneducated president, taking into account Putin's experience, and his hopes and expectations that the West would not support Ukraine in this way, to this extent, and will not be that united. There were lots of expectations and hopes, lots of points which were considered by Russia that they won't be able to provide us with help and support. And also Russia did not rely upon the resistance which emerged within our society. So they did not acknowledge the existence of the Ukrainians themselves, because every criminal action of Russia and expectation that it will break the resistance through created even more of resistance. So besides that, lately we could see this kind of impact or pressure on two European countries, which was an energy one. And the Russians, if you could see, even created a video And Putin used the fairy tale that they should be frozen. So there are lots of expectations online that there is the fear of this energy crisis and that the energy will become more expensive, that it could lead to serious response among the European society. So there were lots of means which were already created, but they did not play the significant role. So the nuclear weapons is the last resort, which scares the world because the consequences cannot be foreseen, and also the certain unforeseeable character of Putin's actions. Because from the rational and sane point of view, that what he launched, the full-scale war, what he waged as the war, and the consequences for Russia itself were really devastating, and for other countries as well, the losses which are already working.
They are and not really reasonable from even his standpoint. So this is the way he uses to get the results he wants. So in your opinion, Nataliya, speaking of China, a very strong player, what will be its position here? Is it possible that Putin will use nuclear weapons without consulting with China? Can China agree with this? There are cases when China has started providing weapons. So what are the possible unfolding of the events in the future? Well, we hope for the positive impact of China in this time, because judging from how China positions itself as a responsible global power, all the actions of Russia since the very beginning do not go in line and actually contravene with China's intentions. So also China has received some indirect negative consequences in terms of economy, energy, etc. At the same time, it tries to remain neutral or pretends to be neutral. And for instance, in the UN meetings, there were meetings of representatives of China with Lavrov, Blinken, and Ukrainian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. China has announced its own narrative. It says that the U.S. is the power creating all of those problems. U.S. brings forth war, and China brings in something that's totally contrary. So we would like to see some steps from China proving its image it's creating. So, for instance, China would contribute to some peace negotiations, or let's say China is saying that it's promoting global initiatives globally in terms of food safety, for instance. We would like to see China among those countries contributing to the unblocking of our seaports so that Putin would be unable to use this as his leverage. So we do not see China actually doing this. And also when the Chinese Minister of Foreign Affairs mentioned that they support the idea of safety around the nuclear power station, we hear that they sort of support the IATA resolution, according to which Russians need to bring their troops out of the NPT, and still China votes against. So why is it voting against? So these steps are not really consequential. That's because China is so deeply engaged in this game with the United States, and in Russia it sees some pain points. So, for instance, the story of AUKUS and the transferring of the nuclear submarines. So, when promoting its own narratives, Uh, China is not really noticing the real threat, both in our country and in the world, in fact, if Putin actually starts the nuclear war, starts using nuclear weapons. So this is why the future steps are unpredictable, and actually everyone need to contribute to the world to deal with this possible unwanted consequences. So, Vadym, what do you think about the risk of the use of nuclear weapons? Well, speaking of this nuclear blackmail, we need to understand that in many ways Putin is already acting illogically. So this is the level of emotions, and these are the steps that are not really pragmatic. So we need to begin with the fact that uh, the greatest tragedy for Putin, the greatest tragedy of the 20th century was the collapse of Soviet Union. And in his official speeches, we could also hear that he was worried about the Caribbean crisis, and that that Khrushchev was frightened at that moment, and he believes that the Soviet Union could win in that conflict with the US. So there is not much logic in there, but we should keep this in mind. And he has always had this desire in him to go through the Caribbean crisis once again and to win over the US without actually using the weapons. So kind of repeating the history, but the opposite way. And he believes that the politicians in the world are weak right now, such as Biden, and he has mentioned that after Gandhi there's no one to speak with. So that's aspect number one. The second one, speaking of Putin as a person, he is a person with very strong sociopathic features, and they have such people quite low level of fear and pain. So 2 or 3 weeks ago, I told everyone that Putin will try to frighten everyone, but he will never proceed with the actual nuclear strikes. But after Samarkand, something has happened, and we started dealing with the collective Putin, so to speak. So the threat actually goes up, but I still hope that common sense will win. So we need to understand that we are not dealing with logic here. We are now beyond any logic, and this is why the threat has gone up over the last 2 weeks. Dear colleagues, do you have anything to add now? Yes, I'd like to add briefly. I'd like to focus on the fact that Ukraine's position, the position of Ukrainian experts, and in fact Ukraine's official position expressed also in the article by Valery Zaluzhny, any use of nuclear weapons will not change the strategic course of Ukraine and will not change the direction of this war. So we have quite serious losses, quite serious destructions, deaths of civilians that have happened already, and we have to perceive everything through this lens. And also, the position of our Western partners will be important now. We need to understand that the Western world will not make any preventive strikes with nuclear weapons, because it's against all the previous logic of the balance that existed before. So it's important to discuss with our partner countries to make sure that all the possible reactions are discussed with Russia, so that they understand the level of threat for them as well. And one of the factors here is that any nuclear strike on Ukraine will be perceived as a threat to the countries of NATO, and because of that, Article 5 will be activated. This is something broadly discussed among the experts right now, and I believe these are some of the options that should be discussed by our partners officially for Russia to clearly understand the consequences it will have. Also, nuclear weapons have become increasingly important since the moment Putin came to power. Actually, even before he became president, well, he still was the national security secretary. So in the West, no one was really getting ready for the war with the Russian Federation. But this is when the changes of the doctrine of the 60s have started to change. The doctrine that was established after the Caribbean crisis, when the world started to regulate this issue and when the great treaties were signed on non-proliferation, etc. And from the military standpoint, there is no sense in nuclear strikes on Ukraine, and the current mobile war of maneuvers. Any kind of nuclear warheads can destroy some people, can destroy some equipment, and also pollute the territory, but this will not impact any changes from the political standpoint. And also, there can be a strike on some critical infrastructure, maybe a strike on Kyiv. We cannot exclude this as well. But for sure, there will be a negative response in this case, even from North Korea, because, you know, nuclear weapons are intended to be used as a threat and not for the actual use. So these are the threats to the West, first and foremost. And when the US say that there will be quite serious response from them, and a couple of months ago we could see an article from the White House where it was clearly said that such a strike would be perceived as an attack against NATO countries because radiation knows no borders. So the neighbor countries such as Poland and Romania, who are NATO members, will also be impacted. So this way, this can entail some asymmetrical strike or something similar to a nuclear strike. And we need to understand this. Another thing to mention here, and it's clear in Washington's communication, that Russians should not do this. You can see in the rhetorics of Mr. Scholz, who was limiting the support of Germany for Ukraine in terms of tanks and other military equipment. Now he's even more frightened, and this will be one of the actors supplying pressure to Ukraine. We already see that Germany is a weak link. And we can also see what was happening in Italy yesterday. So this is a country that's maybe less important in terms of military equipment supplied to us, but it's also important from the standpoint from EU and NATO. And we also have Hungary, our neighbor country, here. So this is a pressure intended for them to change their stance, to reduce our support. So Ukraine is surely not going to lay down its weapons. We only have one choice, whether we protect ourselves and our future, or whether we just agree to have genocide of the Ukrainian nation. Yesterday, it was mentioned by the president that 2 more mass graves were discovered in Izum, there were 430 bodies found before that, and now more are being found. So there are many citizen towns like that. We have nothing to lose, and these threats are surely not intended for us, because they don't work here. I do agree with the idea about Putin's irrationality and, Putin's attention for the big dates. So the Caribbean crisis was happening in October, and quite soon they are going to take the decision on the annexation of new Ukrainian territories, and then they will intend to replay the Caribbean crisis in a way. This way, it will be even more dangerous. Khrushchev was a fool, but he was at war and he saw the atrocities, and Kennedy has saw war as well. So this factor of personal experience and responsibility was there. Putin does not have any of this. Putin believes that it was a weakness of the KGB and the military. It was the reason of the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Therefore, he will be playing a risky game in his relations with the United States, and this crisis is surely different because it's not the US that's in conflict with the Russian Federation directly, but the weapons which are not permitted to use. Russia will be showing that it's actually ready to use it. So, dear colleagues, your questions, please. Use the microphone if you want to ask anything. We have simultaneous interpretation, therefore we need a microphone. So the question to Alina and Vadym: do we need to have any additional mobilization for the Ukrainian military? If yes, what are the possible numbers? Because we heard from Mr. Arestovich that Ukraine will probably have to do some partial mobilization, maybe up to 5.5 million people, but this is surely a big number. But what's your opinion? I believe it's the armed forces of Ukraine and the general staff that will define these needs. Ukraine is not the country covering trenches with cannon fodder. I do not believe in such huge numbers as 5.5 million. We can see right now that the first wave has happened. It wasn't really mobilization, but we had lots of volunteers, lots of those in the territorial defense. We had people of certain professions drafted, but after that, after the beginning of the war, we did not have any serious waves of mobilization, which means we have enough people for the tasks defined by the general staff and the command of the armed forces of Ukraine. So if they are in need of additional troops, this mobilization will surely be happening. And I believe if we are seeing the increase of mobilized persons in Russia, there will possibly be such a need, but we still have people willing to join the army. Even now we have lots of volunteers who actively want to join the armed forces, but generally our citizens need to understand that at any moment we need to be ready to protect ourselves, to protect our motherland and our friends and family. So these are not lofty words. This is something that we should take as our reality. But still we have sufficient numbers of those who would participate in mobilization if necessary. Ukraine Forum, Alina Denysenko. Speaking of the threat of a nuclear strike from Russia in terms of civilian defense, do you believe the Ukrainian government or the experts or NGOs, do they have to strengthen the information campaign for civilians concerning the behavior of civilians in case of such a strike, and what should be done for this?
Who will answer this question? Well, I guess as a person who was born during the Soviet times, I remember those slogans and the films which were propaganda, if it happens tomorrow, speaking about nuclear war. Of course, there is such a probability, but we shouldn't intimidate the people, and it seems to me we shouldn't neglect it, or we shouldn't have this, kind of behavior if we do not prepare the populations for all the possible options and all the actions. Of course, I've seen, at least in the media, in Ukrainska Pravda, there was a very detailed instruction how you should act. So, of course, we should prepare and train the specialists, the experts who will provide treatment. They will, in fact, uncontaminate the territories. So we have been strengthened with aid by our Western partners. We are given the necessary equipment, and of course I understand our authorities that there should be some of the steps conducted, but without panic. But if you don't do that and something horrible really happens, we still should be grown-ups. We should have this planning already done, and we should make the population aware. Any other questions? Could I add? It seems to me that I've seen some warnings from the Ukrainian authorities about some of the bulletins which were disseminated, but also I'd like to say that there is another aspect. That is, in fact, the practical training, not only by us, but by the Western countries, and it is taking place. We can see that the United States have already increased the defense capability and the combat capability of their troops, observing the behavior of the Russians with their nuclear weapons. I haven't seen the official statements, but I got a phone call from France, and I was told that the submarines were taken from Brest. Of course, it needs to be confirmed, but they are now already in the defense capacity. So besides the training of the Ukrainian population, some of the means which are parts of deterrence are now activated. Some of the preparatory demonstrative actions are done by our partners, which is important to demonstrate the readiness of both the population and any of the actions in this counteraction against the armed forces with the participants of the armed forces of our partners and Ukraine. Did you want to add anything? Well, it's just my personal opinion. I've got the necessary iodium pills in my backpack. Of course, you don't need it now, but all the teenagers, they have these pills with them, and they know that it should be more for the case of some crazy actions of Russia at Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, but still every citizen has to take care about himself or herself. We are not in the Soviet Union where we should wait for some orders of the superiors. So every single person has to take care about him or herself. There is the role of the state and the media to provide people with truthful information. You could install an app to look at the level of radiation pollution all over the area of Ukraine. And by the way, recently the map was created about that. It seems to me it was done by the State Emergency Service. So we as the citizens, we should be conscious and we should take care about ourselves and our relatives. I thank you, dear experts. I thank you for this meeting, for such an important information which we heard from you. Dear colleagues, I remind you that we were joined by Vadym Denysenko, who had to leave a bit earlier. We had Alina Frolova, Nataliya Butyrska, and Olexander Khara. I thank you for the interest to this topic. I thank you that you've been with us. Goodbye.